It's important to remember Joaquin Gaspar's contribution to understanding Portolan maps. He spent a life looking at Portolan maps, and for that reason he's advanced our understanding quite considerably. Consider, for example, the statement of a rather prominent librarian, Marguerite Ragnau, who's the editor of Terra Incognita and curator of the James Ford Bell Library at the University of Minnesota. They have a Portolan map in their collection there, and she describes it. Let's take a listen.
Portolan charts like this remain an enigma, in part because we have no records of what they are intended to portray, how they are intended to be used. And they're full of iconographic illustrations. The name Portolan comes from an Italian word for pilot. And scholars believed in an earlier era that these were actually used for navigation. Scholars today are questioning whether or not Portolan charts were ever actually used for navigational purposes. The charts indicate along the coastlines little red dots and other markers that indicate potential hazards for sailors. However, the map is not detailed enough to actually sail those waters. What it could have done was provide an indication to a captain of industry or a captain of an expedition planning a voyage, and it would let him know when he would need to hire a local pilot to help guide him through those waters. Not enough work has been done on Portolan charts. Most of the research that has been done on most of the research that we do have was done in the early part of the 20th century. And it's not a subject that scholars are spending a lot of time on right now. That's too bad. I was able to convince a graduate student here at the University of Minnesota to work on this Portolan chart last year, and he came up with some very interesting work concerning why Canepa may have made this anachronistic map, this portrayal of Genoese commercial interests in the Black Sea nearly 40 years after those commercial interests ceased to be available to them. More work needs to be done, and I'm hoping that a new generation of scholars will be attracted to these Portolan charts and bring to light some of the mysteries that still remain.
Other collections at other universities are available as well. There are Portolan charts in the Beinecke Library at Yale, and they too describe them, but don't shed a whole lot of light on how they came into existence or how they were used or what in fact they represent. They have in fact just a silent narrative presenting it on YouTube. Take a look. The Yale librarians are quite proud of their collection, and they've done a great job of, in fact, cataloging the material and presenting it in a digital manner so that scholars can use it from around the world. This is a very handsomely bound collection of Portolan maps. But it's important to remember that John Hessler emphasized Joaquin Gaspar's revolutionary contributions to allowing us to understand several different things going on within the Portolan charts. Let's listen again to his introduction.
Our first speaker today, this afternoon, Joaquin Gaspar, is one of those scholars who not only does intensive and deep scholarship, but one of those scholars who transform a discipline, transform the study of a particular type of object. Joachim, whose dissertation committee I was on when he received his doctorate, I'm not being, one-sided here, but it was a very good defense, basically has begun to apply very analytical tools to some of the interesting technical questions associated with not only things like Portolan charts, but also mysteries like the Mercator projection. How was it mathematically constructed? He's done a lot of work and published in many essays and in Imago Mundi and several other journals. If you've never read his dissertation on Portolan charts, I would suggest it is required reading. He has just recently received one of the first millionary research grant from the European Research Council in the history of cartography, since the European Research Council was founded, to study the technical developments of the Portolan chart. And so without further ado, Joachim.
Joaquin Gaspar summarized a very important transition between different kinds of mapping traditions. The Portolan chart itself, which dominated from 1250 and existed right up through 1750, the 18th century. The latitude chart, which in fact began to dominate from the 1500 onwards, and the Mercator chart. All three different mapping traditions based on different mathematics and different calculations, different representations of things in the ocean and on land. It's worth listening to his emphasis of that and his conclusion once again.
Three different navigational cartographic models were developed throughout history. The Portolan chart, based on magnetic courses and estimated distances, the latitude chart, based on magnetic courses and latitudes, and the Mercator chart, based on geographical coordinates and through rhumb line directions. Not only these three models were designed to support specific and distinct navigational methods, but also they were mutually incompatible. We know that the content of nautical charts was routinely used to construct lavish depictions of the world to be offered to emperors and popes and to be employed by them as symbols of glory and national power. At the time, however, none of those people were aware of the fact that such representations were not real maps and that the continents, the islands, and the coastlines were distorted in weird and unsuspected ways. These distortions were noticed by the instructed cosmographers, who insisted to have them corrected, being systematically opposed by cartographers and pilots who invoked the safety of navigation. Only today can we fully understand the subtle technical reasons behind these disputes and conclude, first, that historically nautical charts can only be understood in the context of the navigational methods they were intended to support. And second, that a nautical chart should not be considered as a true geographical map, but as a diagram to support navigation. Thank you.
But why does the world move from Portolan charts to printed maps in a relatively short period of time? What's the changed context which has taken place that really alters these three different mapping traditions? and favors a certain kind of mapping from the 16th century onwards. Dr. Gaspar gives us a key clue to understanding what has happened.
We know that the content of nautical charts was routinely used to construct lavish depictions of the world to be offered to emperors and popes and to be employed by them as symbols of glory and national power. At the time, however, none of those people were aware of the fact that such representations were not real maps and that the continents, the islands and the coastlines were distorted in weird and unsuspected ways. These distortions were noticed by the instructed cosmographers, who insisted to have them corrected, being systematically opposed by cartographers and pilots who invoked the safety of navigation.
As Dr. Gaspar emphasized, we know that the content of nautical charts was routinely used to construct lavish pictures of the world to be offered to emperors and popes and to be employed by them as symbols of glory and national power. This is a crucial transformation, not so much of map technology, but of map intentions. The structure of the production of maps changes. In addition to incorporating new information about different parts of the world, the map is being counted upon to do different things. And as he says, nautical charts were routinely used to construct lavish pictures of the world to be offered to emperors and popes and to be employed by them as symbols of glory and national power. This shift in the purpose of the map from a navigational chart is crucial to understand. And it occurs right at the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century. Within 2 years of Columbus's discoveries, something major happened in the cartographic world because of a treaty that was reached and the political decisions that were made. The treaty had to do with a line that was drawn down a meridian in the Atlantic. Let's consider for a moment the rapidly changing world following 1492 and try to place both the discoveries of Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci and the history of cartography in the larger context of a new Atlantic world.
Here is a short synopsis of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Signed at Tordesillas in Spain on June 7, 1494, this agreement divided the newly discovered lands outside Europe between the Portuguese and Spanish empires. The dividing line of demarcation was about halfway between Portugal's Cape Verde Islands off the west coast of Africa and the islands explored by Christopher Columbus on his first voyage in 1492, which were claimed for Spain. The lands to the east would belong to Portugal and the lands to the west to Spain. Steve, what is the background of this treaty up to the year 1493?
It's a really complicated story, and there's a lot of twists and turns. Really, at the heart of this issue is a major dynastic fight that happened in the Iberian Peninsula, what we would today call modern-day Spain and Portugal. In the late 1400s, there was really no such thing as Spain per se. Portugal was an independent kingdom with more or less the same borders that we would see on the map today. Now, the complicated story between these kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula, it's really worth taking a quick look at this backstory, especially the fights between the royal families in this conflict, because that's a large driver of the story. But in short, what was going on in the Iberian Peninsula in the 1400s was the kingdom that would become Spain was 3 kingdoms and emirate. There was the Kingdom of Castile, which was most of the central and northern part of the peninsula. Then you had the Kingdom of Aragon, which was most of the east coast. A small kingdom of Navarre, which was lodged in the Pyrenees in between France and Spain. And that included part of the Basque country. Then you had the Emirate of Granada, which was the last Muslim outpost in the Iberian Peninsula, which was located in the high Sierra Nevada mountains in the south of Spain. So the royalty of all these kingdoms intermarried all the time, trying to tie the whole peninsula together. Now, in the time leading up to the 1490s, and 1480s, Castile, this main central kingdom, was ruled by a weak king named Enrique. He had major problems producing an heir that the aristocracy of Castile would support and approve of. Enrique had a sister named Isabella, who also had a claim to the crown as well. And the whole idea of primogeniture, where sons had to be the next in line for the kingdom, was not as locked in Spain and Portugal as it was in, say, like England at that time.
Interesting.
Now, Enrique, he wanted to marry off Isabella for a variety of reasons. There was some talk about her marrying a really high member of the French court and some other nobles, but none of these really went anywhere for a variety of reasons. Now, Isabella, she was a teen at this time, and she found a fellow named Ferdinand, the next in line to be the king of the Kingdom of Aragon, next door to Castile.
I have a hard time imagining Queen Isabella as a young teenage princess, because our image of her in all the paintings and in the history that is often told is of a very mature, strong, powerful woman.
It's so funny too. And before reading this and really digging into the history, that's what I had in my mind. But then as we see later how Ferdinand and Isabella, they were married when they were about, I believe Ferdinand was about 17 and Isabella was a little bit younger than that. So they came up together and really grew into adults with each other, into this powerful power couple that we'll see in the 1490s. It's a really fascinating character arc for them. It really is Ferdinand and Isabella. It's hard to separate the two.
And I think that Queen Isabella even had a military side to her as she got older. She became a queen that would actually go onto the battlefields. Maybe you can just give us a word or two on the Reconquista period. That's what we're living in at this point, where these various kingdoms are trying to reunite Spain by kicking out or conquering the Muslims that occupy the southern part of the peninsula.
Yeah, so that's a fascinating part of the story. The Muslims had conquered almost all of the Iberian Peninsula. Slowly, over the centuries, they started to reconquer parts of the Iberian Peninsula, and they formed various kingdoms. But out of that mix, these kingdoms of Portugal, Castile, and Aragon are the ones that formed the nucleus, and they were the ones that became the most powerful kingdom, along with Navarre. In about the 1200s, almost all of the peninsula had been taken back except for the very extreme south, which would become the Emirate of Granada. By about the end of the 1200s, Portugal had been reconquered in almost its a shape that it has today. And it took a long time for that last holdout kingdom to be reconquered. And it was really Isabella and Ferdinand who were the ones who put together the last campaign to conquer Granada. That is what kickstarted Spain, or what we could really call Castile and Aragon, to get into the voyage of discovery game that Portugal had been very heavily invested in for the past few decades of the 1400s.
Although Portugal hadn't been sailing west as Columbus eventually did, they'd been sailing south and trying to explore the African coast and go around the continent, and they eventually did, in order to reach Asia.
That's a key part that's going to play into the whole story of the Treaty of Tordesillas and some of the treaties that led up to the Treaty of Tordesillas.
The key year in all this, Steve, is 1492, and that's perhaps one of the key years in all of human history, because we've got the age of discovery that's gaining momentum. We've got Spain, well, the different kingdoms of the peninsula that would eventually become a united Spain, conquering Granada and basically realizing their dream of the Reconquista. We've got Christopher Columbus sailing west. We've got the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and we've got the Inquisition.
When Isabella marries Ferdinand of Aragon, that's what's going to cement together what we call Spain. So Isabella, she becomes the Queen of Castile. She's married to the King of Aragon, and we have this joint kingdom now.
So in 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand, on behalf of Spain, sponsor Columbus's voyage west. And it's because of Columbus's new explorations that other countries get involved, the papacy get involved, and they want to try and sort all of this out.
There's one event that happens that's really the massive Kickstarter for why Portugal and Spain feel the need to go exploring was the fall of Constantinople, which was only 40 years, less than 40 years.
Yeah, 1453.
Which
your
was
math is good, Steve. Your math is good.
So that was less than 40 years before 1492 and Columbus setting off. What the significance of the fall of Constantinople was the spice trade, which was the reason Portugal was trying to inch its way around Africa. As they're desperately looking for what was called the Spice Islands and the Indies, which they didn't have a great idea what these places were all about, but they knew that this is the place where they got pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, all these really key and important spices in Europe. That's where they were getting from. They were coming through Constantinople to Venice and the Italian states. They were outrageously expensive. They were worth their weight in gold or more because they had to be somehow traded between modern day India and Indonesia and make their way through to Europe. And they would go through many, many, many middlemen to get to Europe. Now, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks really put a strangle on the spice trade. They weren't trading a ton of spices, and the spices that they were trading, they were selling at even more outrageous prices. It's hard to find an analogy in the modern day of a commodity that was so critical to people's lives being cut off. And you know these commodities are coming from somewhere, but how do you find them? This time period between the 1450s and the 1490s is when Europeans, particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish, really start trying to figure out how can we get these spices directly from the source.
Let me try and make an analogy with the oil and gas crisis of the 1970s. Oil and gas had always been very cheap to obtain, easy to obtain, plentiful. And then in the 1970s, there was a crisis where basically it was cut off and there was a stranglehold of the product itself. That began a whole new wave of research and exploration here on the continent in North America, so that one day, decades later, North America basically has become energy independent. So you can make that analogy with Constantinople that fell in 1453, and now European countries have to slowly look for alternative ways of reaching Asia. And one of them was exploring down the coast of Africa, as we've mentioned, and finally reaching the tip of Africa. I think it was in 1488. And this was a legacy of Prince John the Navigator and his whole system of encouraging Portuguese sailors and technology in order to do so. Explorers round the tip of Africa in 1488, and Columbus, only 4 years later, sails west.
Yeah, and so that conquest of Constantinople, that did a few things. It really did three things that impacted directly the need for these voyages of discovery. It cut off the spice trade. It put a bunch of really great Italian cartographers, navigators, and sailors out of jobs. These people knew how to manage ships. They knew everything about sailing and how to navigate. They're out of work. They're ready to go work for Portugal and Spain. And the last thing that happened was it pushed out a lot of the Greek scholars of Constantinople who knew a lot about ancient cartography and ancient theories on things such as the size of the earth.
The changed context was changed because of the Treaty of Tordesillas and the importance that it gave to terrestrial maps. The treaty itself was signed on the 7th of June, 1494, about a year and a half after Columbus's discoveries. It was a major document that changed the nature of mapping and charting. In particular, it came up with a line of demarcation, which was very important in sociological and political terms. It didn't have any particular natural basis to it. It was a line on a map, beginning a very interesting tradition of drawing lines on maps and then determining the way people behaved in reference to those lines. In effect, the line divided the world between where Portugal was to have dominant sway and where the Spanish were to have a dominant sway. The Treaty of Tordesillas and the importance of terrestrial maps then is crucial, because from here on in, terrestrial maps began to be foregrounded in importance over nautical charts. The reason is simple. It's difficult to control large bodies of ocean, but somewhat simpler to control destination points at the terminus of transportation systems to cross those oceans. To put it another way, maps came to depict positions on land and reinforce the statements about who owned or controlled those positions, rather than how to get to that piece of land. So these destinations were indicated with a very firm indication of a meridian from the very beginning. This 1502 Portolan makes it very clear the outlines of Asia are not very distinct. India is all out of proportion. Africa is much larger than it actually is. The Red Sea is there, and you can see that very clearly. But little is known about what's on the other side of this demarcation line. It's very clear, though, that some portions of what became known as the Americas were on the west side and some on the east side. The Portuguese got to claim control over everything on the east side of that line. So that demarcation line becomes a very important one for the definition of a new kind of entity, the Atlantic empires. Seaborne empires were well known in the Mediterranean, particularly those that conflicted with one another, the Ottoman Turks and the Europeans. But the Ottoman Turks, in effect, controlled the Mediterranean, especially after the fall of Constantinople. And it's that loss of control on the part of the northern countries from Europe that thrust them out into the Atlantic to discover a new system and try to chart access to it through the oceans, but more particularly start to declare ownership or dominance or political control over the continental aspects of the empires that they sought to establish. This led to a great deal more detail being given to what was on land than had previously been given. Yes, there is still the naming tradition of different ports of call, And in fact, Henry the Navigator from Portugal gave the incentive to navigators to cover a certain distance each year to be measured in leagues, and they would get compensated on that basis. So even when the maps have Arabic notations on them, as this one does, this Portolan, it's systematically exploring not the Mediterranean, but the coastal regions of Africa, largely in order to gain secure access to what, after about the turn of the century, became known to the Portuguese as the access to the Indies. These maps are very interesting. They're Portolan still, and they can be seen in collections to have several new developments in them, including the indication by flags of which European potentate is said to control that particular terminus in the trade. The trade now conducted in the Atlantic. There's also a very interesting effort, you can see it in the 1570 Portolan, to delineate an edge. Previously, Portolans were largely determined by the vellum itself, the skin upon which the ink was rested and, in fact, dried, and it took on a proportion of the shape of that skin. Not so increasingly, as there's an effort to bound, to not only claim particular areas here and name the different ports of call along the way, but to frame and claim. A very interesting transformation in the understanding of what cartography is all about. If you look in at these maps in detail, like this Lopez Portolan, you can see that it emphasizes these power relations in a very significant way by indicating the flags of the Europeans involved and where they're being planted on the coasts, in this case of the west coast of Africa, with a great deal of detail being given as well to outsized islands, islands that are much larger than they actually are in scale terms, because that's the terminus point, and in fact the ways in which the jumping off to the New World occurs. Now, Yale is known to have Portolan sea charts in the Beinecke Rare Book Library, linking the Mediterranean with the Atlantic. And it's amazing the work that they've done to both preserve these things in very beautiful bindings, but also develop finding aids and sharing digital material from them. The librarians have put themselves to this task in a very deliberate way so that you can look at some of these Portolan atlases that were assembled after they'd been made, obviously, not in the sense of a published book, because these are manuscript maps, but you can see the clear detail involved here with the depiction of the Iberian Peninsula and the west coast of Africa, with, as I say, an outsized representation of the Canary Islands here and the Azores here. These are very important nautical charts, but also important statements about power on the part of rulers and emperors and popes. These are represented in more global terms with larger areas than any one portion, including large parts of southern Africa, right up to what became known as the Red Sea and was actually painted as the Red Sea at the time. And the entirety of it is presented in a global form, where Africa now comes to depend on a new kind of role, a transatlantic role, where this meridian plays a key effort to divide the influence areas of the Spanish from the Portuguese. no longer focused on the Mediterranean as a sea, but on the open Atlantic. Within the African continent, the Portolans are given some detail to potentates who are said to be in charge of various portions of Africa that the Europeans managed to reach on the coastal areas. Some of these are very interesting for their iconography. These are not photographs, obviously, but they're representations of different kingdoms and their attributes, including one that became very famous as Prester John, Janus, or Jan, Prester Jan. The Christian symbol of the cross here and a mitre on his head is an indication symbolically that this is a Christian king, not far from the Red Sea as it's depicted and the area of what's now known as Ethiopia. The global representation of both New World and Old World areas then takes on a framed component to it in these Portolan charts at the Yale Library. The framing of these things is even more explicit in maps like the Pierre Desailly 1550 map, where once again the Red Sea is present, but each continent gets some specification of what's there because the representation has to do with who is in touch with them and who's in control of that trade nexus. Can't control the ocean so much, but you can control the entrepôts on either side of an ocean, and that's what begins to be mapped in great detail. Major scholarship has recently been published by Alida Metcalf on the charting and mapping of the Atlantic system. Emphasis on the Atlantic system. It's very interesting that basically around 1500, this started to be the refocus from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, as the fall of Constantinople made it impossible for navigators to make much headway in moving east through the Ottoman Turk systems of controlling the trade with Asia. Similarly, thorough research is now needed for the continent of Africa, not just the oceans, which has received justifiable attention because of the importance that Portolan charts serve as a bridge to an understanding of oceanic charting. But we need to start looking at the continental depiction, starting with the Portolan charts, but continuing on into an era of the print map. This task is in its early days, really early days. Fortunately, Yale is hosting an important set of new communities of discussion in this realm with the map exhibits it has recently opened for the public. In July, it opened a major map exhibit at the Beinecke, looking at the world of maps, 1400 through 1600. It includes some Portolan charts. I should say, I'm not sure that the exhibit includes them, but Yale's collections do include them. So whether or not they're included in this particular exhibit is something that could be extended through the study of their other library assets. And Yale also has a rich collection of early printed maps that are held in the Beinecke and digitized as well. Even though the map looks upside down here, it's labeled to be read from this angle because Europeans were in effect looking at Africa still from across the Mediterranean. What's apparent, though, is that when you expand these digitized images, you can see that the focus is upon a new kind of ship, no longer slave galley dominant in these waters, in the Mediterranean, but the kind of caravel that the Portuguese became famous for introducing as an ocean-going open vessel with a great deal of luggage capacity, you might call it, that is cargo capacity, for provisioning the crew on longer distance trade and carrying heavier value to weight ratio items in a transatlantic trade. So the world map collection is going to be very interesting to look at because the curators are well aware of the new scholarship, and they have within their possession these older representations of the world with Arabic script around them. And it'll be interesting to see how the discussions emerge in reference to this new mapping tradition, underscored by Alida Metcalf's work. Much of the mapping of the Atlantic system relates directly to the different European traditions of mapping the slave trade from its very earliest days. And we have a lot of work to do in this realm. There's an effort to draw upon the digital collections on an international scale now and share this information for research and teaching in African and American history. It's being facilitated through the Africa Map Circle, and access to these maps that have been digitized is available through scanning in the QR code and looking up the Africa Map Circle and its YouTube channel. After all, the Atlantic trade in Africa really subsisted for about 200 years before the French or the English got involved in it in any heavy measure. It was dominated by the Portuguese and their caravel, their particularly new kind of ship introduced by Prince Henry the Navigator in order to explore a certain number of leagues per year on the coast of Africa. And in their effort to reach a more desirable goal, the Asian trade itself. Now, the Spanish were involved in this as well, but eventually the Dutch come to dominate both the Asian trade and the Atlantic trade. You can see a relative size of a Portuguese caravel here represented compared to the larger and well-armed, cannon-armed ships of the Dutch that are financed not only by the Dutch royal family, but more significantly by the Dutch East India Company, groups of merchants engaged in much larger volumes of trade and seeking to obtain control of the enclaves where trade can be conducted. Not so interested in conquering territory as in holding a fort or a toehold on an island or continent from which to launch these international and interocean expeditions. Commerce and cartography on colonial frontiers has been a theme that's been pursued by a number of historians as a means of re-examining both American and African history. Professor Henry Louis Gates has been a leader in this, and he's allowed many more people to look into it, comparing what's happening on the American frontier, say, for example, with George Washington and those in West Virginia and Western Pennsylvania in what was called the French and Indian Wars, and what was happening at the same time in West Africa. Colonial frontiers have a lot in common around the world. In fact, one of the things they have in common is that they're shatter zones, and shatter zones are difficult to map and very important to map. This kind of map emerges, for example, from the French by a cartographer who becomes quite famous in the 18th century, Jacques-Nicolas Belin. Belin not only charted the Mississippi and all of what was known then as Louisiana, but did detailed charts of the coast and ports, including Boston, all along the east coast of the United States. It's this region where shatter zones are particularly prominent, where one culture is intruding upon another economically, politically, militarily, and shattering the social structures, economic structures, and military defenses of existing populations. So the cartography of shatter zones in global perspective has now led to a new assessment of different parts of the world, not only those being mapped by French cartographers in the New World, but the very same cartographers start taking on map drawing in Africa itself. And a new region, an area of specialty, is the mapping of the shatter zones in Africa. D'Anville, who is a cartographer, began with maps like this, very important maps, indicating how different regions are quite literally shattered into smaller and smaller groups as guns and powder are introduced and they get engaged with warfare with one another. So this theme in the pre-colonial cartography of West African slave trade is absolutely crucial and one that has just begun. It is in very early days. In effect, cartography and colonialism is a theme that will be pursued for years to come. European imaging and imagining of the Dark Continent, from the age of exploration to the scramble for its control, is actually a very fascinating study. In each case, each map has a history that portrays not only the technical abilities of the cartographer, but the political, social, and economic preoccupations of those who employ the cartographers. So cartography and colonialism is something to be studied in conjunction with one another, because the same systems are involved of naming, framing, and claiming. All of the chapters of comparative colonial history, in a sense, are englobed within the framework of the history of cartography. From early on maps like the Portolans, the 1570 map of a Portolan that indicates the flags of the European powers at different toeholds on the coast, through the Jacques-Nicolas Belin series of maps on what became known as the United States, giving in great detail the names and locations of different indigenous populations in the midst of this shatter zone. And finally, right through the 1885 conference, it began in 1884 and concluded in 1885 as an effort on the part of Europeans to use maps as a way to divide up between themselves access to the assets and manpower of different parts of Africa. So the naming, framing, and claiming traditions are as old as colonialism itself, and in fact, each particular episode is a chapter in comparative colonial cartography. These are then early days in African historical cartography, from the Portolan charts to the printed maps, imagining and imaging Africa in the Atlantic system. it promises to be very rich indeed. Thank you very much.